Pat Doris. Welcome to the story. You know, we hear from a fair number of folks in Oregon that Measure 110, which decriminalized drugs, should be repealed, undone, overturned. And now Clackamas County voters will get a chance to let their voices be heard on that issue, at least in a symbolic way. The action Clackamas County commissioners took to make that happen today, that is our big story tonight. I just checked, and Clackamas County has roughly 310,000 registered voters this month. Yeah, they update it each month. 102,000 are not affiliated with any party, 102,000 are Democrats, and 83,000 are Republicans. But overall, I think the county feels like the most conservative in the metro area. So maybe it's not a surprise that the commissioners there, fed up with Measure 110, decided to ask voters what they think about it. The commissioners agreed to put 2 questions to voters during next year during the May presidential primary election. They want voters to answer whether state lawmakers representing Clackamas County should be directed to do anything they can to fix or repeal ballot Measure 110. Commissioners also want voters to decide if they should demand that Governor Kotek call a special session to fix or overturn Measure 110. Now, I know some of you are rolling your eyes. Others are saying, hey, it's about time. It seems to me this is an obvious symbolic vote by the county commission, but Board Chair Tootie Smith told me today not so much. She hopes it actually pushes other government leaders to do the same thing.
It is sending a message, and I hope it makes a difference. I hope other jurisdictions will take what we're trying to do the same thing in either their cities or their counties to tell the legislature, you need to fix this problem. There are several bills in the legislative session dealing with Measure 110 to try to either change them or tweak them, and all of them didn't do anything. Instead, the legislature's answer is to spend more money on housing when we're not addressing why people need housing, why we have a homeless situation, and this is a very large cause of homelessness.
Well, yes, and we've heard from experts that the combination of mental illness and lack of affordable housing and drug use are common themes for those who are homeless. Smith told me that she personally believes Measure 110 should be repealed, and she believes a lot of voters now regret voting for that bill. So I asked if she feels that way, why doesn't she start an initiative petition to actually repeal the law instead of asking her county's lawmakers to see what they can do?
It's very difficult to gather enough signatures, as you know, Pat, statewide to do that. It's really not up to the Board of County Commissioners to do an initiative position. We could support those efforts, but this streamlines the process. It tells the legislature, you need to step up and you need to take the responsibility of what's happening in our state. You know, Pat, Oregon has become a laughingstock nationally. This is the only state in America who has decriminalized illicit and harmful drugs, and we've got to stop it.
Although, again, the most direct route to do that would be through an initiative petition if that's what you want the outcome to be. Instead, Clackamas voters will be asked to give the governor and their state lawmakers direction. Commissioners heard that putting those 2 questions to voters next spring is going to cost roughly $80,000 to $90,000. Taxpayers are going to foot the bill. Commissioner Ben West addressed that issue head on during their meeting today.
And by the way, I know it's expensive. Tens of millions of dollars have been spent on this really bad policy that it cost a lot of lives and a lot of heartache and a lot of social strife. So this is a drop in the bucket to the pain we're all feeling.
Anytime we talk about Measure 110 on this show, you let us hear it with your emails and your voicemails. Last night, we brought you a new PSU study that shows the majority of law enforcement sees 110 as a complete failure, probably no surprise, and many of you agreed.
Measure 110 is a total waste of time. All we're doing is telling drug addicts they can do drugs. You're just enabling. These people need to get a job. They need to go back to work. They need to be self-sufficient. Enough said.
And Nora wrote to us that Measure 110 is horrible. It needs to be repealed. Letting drug-addicted homeless have drugs without consequences and then expecting them to come to rehab is ridiculous. And how about this one from Joe? I will admit I voted in favor of Measure 110, but I've seen enough. Put it back on the ballot. Let the people decide again after what has happened to our city. A viewer named Mike wrote in with this unique and informed perspective. I am an addict. A core belief of any recovering addict is that their addiction problem got so painful that they needed to start recovery. Measure 110 does not allow the addict to experience enough pain, so they will start the recovery. Now, I know this will be hard for some of you to believe, but we have a very big tent here, and a lot of folks watch our show from all sorts of different political beliefs, and there are a lot of voters who think Measure 110 is the right way to go.
I personally think that Measure 110 is a very good measure, and, I personally believe that, they should be cutting funding out of the Multnomah County Jail and use that to build more mental health facilities.
Edward wrote to us, the criminal justice system spent decades on punitive drug policies and got nothing for it beyond giant prisons and overdose deaths. Of course, 110 could be improved, but even if it is far better than what we had before. And finally this from another viewer named Mike. It's none of my business what people put into their bodies as long as they don't do anything to me or others. Make drugs legal on the same model as booze. Even with draconian alcohol control, how many violent bootleggers do we have shooting up our streets? And that's just a sampling of how many of you feel about this. If you feel your blood pressure rising just thinking about Measure 110, you can always vent to our email inbox. We love when we get feedback from all sides. Send it to thestory@kgw.com, or you can call and leave a voicemail. The number is 503-226-5090. Moving on now, within the last half hour, Portland City Council voted to pass Mayor Wheeler's daytime camping ban proposal. The mayor, Rene Gonzalez, and Dan Ryan voted yes. Commissioner Mingus Mapps was not present, but sent a statement saying he does support it. Commissioner Carmen Rubio was the only one to vote no. Here are a few of the key points to the ban. It bans camping in public areas from 8 a.m. until 8 p.m. It also creates a complete ban on all camping on public property, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. That includes parks, near schools and daycares, and in high crash corridors. Homeless people can be warned to move their tents once a day, and if they're warned twice and still refuse to move, then on the third time they can be fined up to $100 and also face up to 30 days in jail. It's worth noting that punishing homeless people is not the goal here. According to the mayor's office, it's to get tents out of public areas. In fact, Commissioner Rene Gonzalez told our team this week that he does not think the jail option will be utilized all that often. The city will create a map that will outline where people can and cannot camp between 8 a.m. and 8 p.m., but no such map exists right now, and it takes effect in 30 days. So now let's head out live to Catherine Cook outside of City Hall. Catherine, you've been in the council chambers as each commissioner voted. They each gave a short speech. What kinds of things did you hear them say?
Well, Pat, it wasn't even as much what kind of things they said, it was how they said it. Each commissioner and the mayor were very confident in how they voted. There was no wishy-washiness. They had their minds made up about this. I want to read you a short statement from Commissioner Dan Ryan that was indicative of what his colleague said, who also voted yes. He said, the first step to recovery is to admit we have a problem. The mayor's proposal demonstrates an honest, balanced, and thoughtful approach to managing public spaces. Portland's best days are ahead of us with hope for recovery. And again, he voted yes. The holdout here, Pat, was Commissioner Carmen Rubio. She was the sole no on this vote, and her reasons she also mapped out very clearly. She said to move the policy forward before it's ready doesn't make sense. She said it feels like a unilateral action by the city, not a partnership. And her reasons behind that really stem on the thought that shelters and logistical services are not ready for this kind of an action, for this kind of a camping ban.
Interesting, Catherine, and it certainly is a significant shift from where the city has been for maybe the last 5 years or so. And we also saw last week at the beginning of this, when they were starting to take testimony from the public, that there were some really disruptive protesters there. Was there anything like that tonight?
No, it was very calm, very peaceful. We had a few folks who had signs on their laps, but nothing was any kind of a disruptive nature. But people are very passionate about this. They feel this ordinance essentially criminalizes homelessness in a different shade. But again, as you mentioned, Pat, the mayor and his team are very adamant on explaining that no, this is simply going to be a step in connecting folks who are on the streets with the services that they need but haven't been receiving. Also, Commissioner Ryan and Gonzalez after the meeting told us one-on-one that this is a piece of what they described as chemical warfare against the drug fentanyl that has crept through our streets and caused so much death and chaos. They hope that this is another piece of solving that problem.
Okay, thank you so much, Catherine Cook.
Up next on the story, Oregon's psilocybin program is up and running, and it's supposed to be funded through licensing fees and a tax on the magic mushrooms. But according to a report from Willamette Week, it looks like taxpayers could actually be on the hook to keep the fungi flourishing. We'll explain why. Plus, whatever happened to that shop in Portland that was illegally selling psychedelic mushrooms with lines wrapped around the block? Kyla Boshi joins me with an update when the story returns.
Let's revisit Oregon's psilocybin program for a moment or two. For those of you wondering, what is that? Well, it's the psychedelic compound found in several kinds of mushrooms. Oregon voters decided to make magic mushrooms legal with Measure 109 passed back in 2020. But it will not be available like cannabis. The psilocybin program has really strict regulations that only allow you to eat the mushrooms inside a licensed service center while being monitored by a licensed facilitator. And, oh yeah, the mushrooms have to be grown by a licensed manufacturer and tested by a licensed lab ahead of time. Get the theme there? Licensing. The Oregon Health Authority started issuing licenses at the beginning of the year. They have not really given out that many. The totals are 3 manufacturers or mushroom growers, 1 laboratory, that's the Rose City Labs that we showed you a few weeks ago. Check out the segment on our YouTube channel if you missed it. 3 service centers and 14 facilitators, so 21 licenses total. Advocates for the psilocybin program say research shows the compounds can help people dealing with depression, addiction, PTSD, even end-of-life care. Despite those potential uses, though, voters in 25 of Oregon's 36 counties voted to ban those psilocybin service centers in their community. They basically said, no, we don't want them here. And that's all fine and good if you feel that way, but if you live in one of those counties, you could still be helping to pay for the program that's happening somewhere else in the state. I know you're probably not too thrilled about that, but guess what? It is looking more and more likely that that's going to happen. We think this article from Willamette Week is worth your time. It's written by Anthony Effinger late last month. It says taxpayers may soon be filling the funding gaps in Oregon's psilocybin system. Licensing fees were supposed to pay for the program after 2 years. Well, the proponents of Measure 109, which created the psilocybin program, designed it to be funded by fees and a tax on mushrooms themselves. That way they could garner more voter support by saying, hey, we're not going to use any taxpayer dollars once it's up and running for 2 years. Well, here's a look at the fees for all of the licensing required to be part of the program. Manufacturers, labs, and service centers have to each pay $10,000 a year, and facilitators pay $2,000 annually. Add those into the 15% tax on psilocybin products themselves, and voila, you have the funding. But there's one problem, one very big problem. Because those fees are so steep, there's not a lot of people stepping in to get a license right now. The psilocybin services program is estimated to cost $3.1 million a year, and in theory be fully funded by those fees, but they are falling woefully short right now. Remember the number of licenses given out so far? 21. If you add up all their licensing fees for this first year, you get $98,000. And because there are not a lot of service centers up and running, the tax on psilocybin itself will not bring in nearly enough to cover the rest of that $3.1 million. Not even close. So what's that mean? Well, the state has to find money somewhere else to keep the program going. Where is the most convenient place to look? The general fund, our tax dollars, of course. Willamette Week reports that OHA has asked for $6.6 million to fill the budget gap for the next biennium, the next 2 years. The head of the psilocybin program told Willamette Week, "We don't believe that licensing fees will be enough to cover the first year of the biennium. We knew it would take some time for licensees to be ready. There are a lot of unknowns right now." One of the biggest issues is if that money will even materialize. Governor Kotek did not put OHA's request for psilocybin money into her recommended budget. Instead, she said to use other fees to pay for the shortfall. According to Willamette Week, other fees means licensing fees, and there's clearly not enough of those. But a spokeswoman for the governor says the state will find the money to keep the program going. She said the governor's office would support a legislative budget committee pointing money toward the program. But I don't know if you've heard, there's a little problem in Salem, the Republican walkout. And what the next budget looks like, it's a little bit up in the air, even if it's going to be passed. And one more question explored by Willamette Week worth considering. Can the program really expect to run on just licensing fees in the future? According to our calculations, even if every single application submitted to OHA thus far was approved, the fees would only bring in around $650,000 annually. Still far, far short of $3.1 million needed. So there's a lot of up in the air right now on the fledgling psilocybin experiment in Oregon. But in order to keep the experiment going, sure is starting to look like your tax dollars are going to be needed. An interesting thing happened in the run-up to that legalization. Not everybody waited. That business across the street with the red and white mushrooms, they didn't wait, and then they got into some trouble. Kyle Laboshi joins me now because you've covered that a lot. Bring us up to speed on this.
Yeah, you might remember it was called SHROOM House, and they were operating right here on West Burnside. It was interesting because people would line up down the street looking to buy magic mushrooms out in the open, they had signs up, a huge billboard advertising as well.
It was wild.
They opened it up in October, were operational for several months, and then in December, police busted the place with a search warrant and essentially shut them down.
And a lot of people wondered why it took so long, but I guess it takes what it takes. What's the latest now?
Yeah, I've been kind of following this case and looking at court records, and one interesting, fairly new development back in March, the city of Portland tried to seize the funds from this place. Not only the cash that they recovered during that raid, but also bank accounts, checking accounts, to the tune of about $30,000 in total through civil forfeiture. That's when police can go in and seize property if it's connected to some kind of crime.
Okay.
After doing so, the judge said, well, hold on a second, let's wait until this criminal matter is wrapped up before you take all that money.
And do these guys face criminal charges?
Right, so in total, 4 people were charged here. The 2 big ones, the owner, Stephen Tachi, and his store manager were charged with 40 felony counts.
4-0.
4-0.
Okay.
Tachi is still awaiting trial. His store manager pled guilty shortly after they were charged as part of a plea deal with prosecutors. Pleaded guilty to 3 charges, the others were dismissed. He's still waiting on sentencing, looks like about 10 days in jail and some probation, things like that. The other 2 workers, who were just folks who worked in the shop, their charges were actually dismissed.
Interesting. So even though you can be open and operating in broad daylight, doesn't mean you're really going to get away with it.
Exactly. And again, we're still waiting on the potential trial for Stephen Tachi, the owner. In the meantime, a judge has allowed him to return to his home in British Columbia so he can care for his infant daughter, and we'll see how this whole thing plays out.
Okay. Great stuff as always. Thanks for the update, Kyle.
Still to come on the story, closing arguments happened today in the lawsuit against Pacific Power over the 2020 Labor Day wildfires. Plaintiffs want $1.6 billion in damages. Investigative reporter Evan Watson was in the courtroom today. He joins us with the latest when the story returns.
Up next at 6:30, if you're sneezing and sniffling, you are not alone. Why this year's pollen season seems to be so much worse, and in some spots, the worst in decades. And does CJ McCollum know something we don't as the NBA draft approaches? Why there's new doubt Damian Lillard will stick around in Portland. That's coming up at 6:30. Hope to see you then.
June is Pride Month, a time for LGBTQ plus people to celebrate. But this year there's fear in that community across the country. According to the Human Rights Campaign, there have been more than 500 bills targeting LGBTQ plus people introduced this year. More than 75 of them have been signed into law. That's prompted the organization to issue their first ever national state of emergency for LGBTQ plus Americans. On their website, they've listed each state and different categories of laws, things like laws about conversion therapy, bathroom restrictions, and bans on gender-affirming care. You can see which laws are in place in each state. For instance, both Oregon and Washington have anti-discrimination laws in place, and neither have bans on gender-affirming care. But that's not the case in every state, so you can scroll through and see exactly what the laws are in whatever state you're going to. The Human Rights Campaign says anti-LGBTQ plus laws are harmful in themselves, but they also result in personal threats. The president of the organization wrote, "The multiplying threats facing millions in our community are not just perceived, they are real, tangible, and dangerous. In many cases, they are resulting in violence against LGBTQ+ people, forcing families to uproot their lives and flee their homes in search of safer states. Overall, the number of laws targeting the community has been growing. The Human Rights Campaign says this year they've seen double the number of laws as last year, and last year was the previous high year on record. Around half of the proposed legislation targets transgender children. And if you do need to go to a state that has laws against LGBTQ+ people, the Human Rights Campaign has a guide on their website that explains where you can go to get health care, how to find community and work, and what to do if your civil rights are violated. Today, attorneys presented closing arguments in the 7-week-long trial over the 2020 Labor Day wildfires. A group of 17 plaintiffs is suing Pacific Power for $1.6 billion in damages. They allege the company caused destructive fires. But Pacific Power argues they're not responsible for what happened. And now a Multnomah County jury will decide the outcome. Evan Watson has the details.
They started the fires. They destroyed the evidence, and now they've come before you and are asking not to be held accountable.
Lawyers for a group of plaintiffs, some whose homes burned down, say Pacific Power is to blame for some of the major Labor Day wildfires in 2020.
It's about their choices not to act. Their choices not to act when all the warning signs were there. All the warning signs of the extreme fire danger that led to this, that led to these 7 weeks of trial.
Wildfire investigations are still ongoing, so a Multnomah County jury will have to determine who or what is at fault. During closing arguments on Wednesday, plaintiffs' attorneys said Pacific Power destroyed evidence of downed power lines and internal communications.
The only Skype messages that they didn't destroy were found in a folder that they had labeled the Purges folder.
On the other side, attorneys for Pacific Power argued it shouldn't be responsible for climate change, saying these fires were unprecedented, other wildfires helped them spread, and it's impossible to eliminate all risk.
You have heard about the historic wind event that took place on Labor Day 2020, a natural event that knocked down healthy trees and spread fires at a rate not seen before in Oregon.
Pacific Power didn't shut off its power lines in the storms, but other companies did turn off electricity in certain areas. Company attorneys say public safety power shutoffs were rare at the time, and turning off power is dangerous to residents.
How should we weigh the risks or the possibility of a fire against the dangers that would be presented by a de-energization?
This case is a class action lawsuit, and 12 jury members will decide on liability and damages. As a final argument, plaintiffs' attorneys told jurors they could hold Pacific Power liable if they decide the company is a substantial cause of the fires, even with unclear investigations.
The idea is you can't destroy the evidence and then stand up and say there's no evidence of your liability. That's not fair. That's not how the law works. You are entitled to infer that the evidence that you were not able to see, that wasn't provided to you in this trial because Pacific Corp destroyed it, that it would be adverse to Pacific Corp.
Evan Watson, KGW News.
It'll be fascinating to see how that shakes out. Hey, that's the end of our show. Thanks so much for watching. But remember, the story, our story, well, that never ends. Stick around now for the news at 6:30, and I'll see you right back here tomorrow.